CR101radio.com, podcasts, and more.
The Chalcedon Foundation presents the Fairfax Resolves 9 through 24, Part 5 of Art A. Rushdoony's lecture series, American History to 1865.
As we continue now with the Fairfax County Resolve, before we go any further, I'd like to just comment on some things that John remarked upon. He said he'd like to see the states do this now to the federal government. Well, he's listing on a real issue. Why don't we hear about this now? Well, since 1860, this kind of thing has been dropped from the textbooks. Why? Because if this was true then, it was true in 1860. In fact, you could take the very arguments that were used by the colonies against Parliament and use them, and some people did in the South, against the federal government in 1860 and 61. Well, naturally, they didn't want those arguments that were used against Parliament and order to be applied to Washington, D.C. So they have dropped out of our textbooks since then. A very important aspect of our history, which is a perversion of our history, because what the Fairfax County Resolves and other things very clearly demonstrate is that we today have the same evil they had then. That we have an invasion by the federal government into the rights and privileges of the counties, the states, and the citizens thereof. To continue now with the Fairfax County Resolves, and if there's a question at any point, don't hesitate to raise your hand, because these are important, and we're going to consider all of the resolves in turn, and I want you to understand them clearly. Number 9, resolve. There is a premeditated design and system formed and pursued by the British ministry to introduce an arbitrary government into His Majesty's American dominion, to which end they are artfully prejudicing our sovereign and inflaming the minds of our fellow subjects in Great Britain by propagating the most malevolent falsehoods, and particularly that there is an intention in the American colonies to set up for independent states, endeavoring at the same time by various acts of violence and oppression, by sudden and repeated dissolutions of our assemblies, whenever they presume to examine the illegality of ministerial mandates, or deliberate on the violated rights of their constituents, and by breaking in upon the American charters to reduce us to a state of desperation and dissolve the original compacts by which our ancestors bound themselves in their prosperity to remain dependent upon the British Crown, which measures, unless effectually counteracted, will end in the ruin both of Great Britain and her colonies. Here it is emphatically stated that they believe the British ministry was working systematically to destroy the colonies, to reduce them to a position of dependence to Parliament, to wipe out their government, on the pretext that the colonies were trying to become independent. Well, the colonies did not set out with a desire to become independent. They were gradually pushed into independence by Britain. This is the point of the Fairfax Resolve. They left them no choice. Either become slaves or become independent. And they chose independence. And so they are saying, it has been our desire to remain free subjects of King George. But a campaign to destroy American independence is underway, to replace it with an arbitrary government with absolutism. And a campaign of slander has been launched against the colonies. Our charters or our constitutions are being attacked by the British ministry. Their desire is to eliminate them, to wipe out our constitutions. And so they make it clear, if you continue in this course, you leave us colonies no choice other than submission or resistance. So don't say we are working for independence and that's what we wanted all along. You're pushing us either to slavery or freedom. And 10, resolve that the several acts of Parliament for raising a revenue upon the people of America without their consent, the creating new and dangerous jurisdictions here, the taking away our trials by jury, the ordering persons upon criminal accusations to be tried in another country than that in which the fact is charged to have been committed, the act inflicting ministerial vengeance upon the town of Boston, and the two bills lately brought into Parliament for abrogating the charter of the province of Massachusetts State and for the protection and encouragement of murderers in the same province are part of the above-mentioned iniquitous system that the inhabitants of the town of Boston are now suffering in the common cause of all British America and are justly entitled to its support and assistance, and therefore that a subscription ought immediately to be opened and proper persons appointed in every county of this colony to purchase provisions and consign them to some gentleman of character in Boston to be distributed among the poor sort of people there. Now, the 10th resolve says that Parliament, first of all, is trying to destroy American self-government. Second, it says that they are trying to create new jurisdictions to abolish trial by jury. And instead of trying people in their colonies, to try them in England where they cannot defend themselves. And third, that military intervention and invasion has accompanied these efforts, and Boston has suffered. In early 1774, before the Fairfax resolves, there had been the Quartering Act. It called for the requisition of buildings in the colonies for the use of royal troops. And General Gage had replaced Hutchinson as governor of Massachusetts on order of Providence, and had appeared in Boston with 4 regiments from England to enforce the Act of Parliament. In other words, they had been invaded by British troops. Their own governor had been set aside, and so the people of Fairfax County were very much concerned. Now, we're going to say more about the Quartering Act when we deal with the Declaration of Independence. It was one of the most horrible instruments of oppression in those days. This is why the Bill of Rights forbids the quartering of troops. Does anyone know what quartering troops meant? Yes. Yes. Now consider what this would mean if somebody brought in troops, and the soldiers in those days were very often the dregs of the sun, the worst characters imaginable. And they put troops in your home, 1 or 2 men, and those men could do as they pleased. And if you resisted them, you could be shot for it. It could mean the rape of the women in the family, the mother and the daughters. And that sort of thing did regularly happen. As a matter of fact, this is how Louis XIV worked to destroy the Huguenots. He gave the Huguenots so much time to become Catholics, and if they did not become Catholics within that date, he was going to quarter troops in every home. Well, this meant that the Huguenots either had to leave the country immediately, or else profess a nominal conversion to Catholicism, or they would have these troops quartered on them. And they knew what that meant. So you can see what a fearful thing this was for the American colonies when they were told troops are going to be quartered on you. Now the 11th resolve. Resolve that we will cordially join with our friends and brethren of this and the other colonies in such measures as shall be judged most effectual for procuring redress for our grievances, and that upon obtaining such redress, if the destruction of the sea at Boston be regarded as an invasion of private property, we shall be willing to contribute towards paying the East India Company the value. But if we consider the said company as the tool and instrument of oppression in the hands of government, and the cause of our present distress, it is the opinion of this meeting that the people of these colonies should forbear all further dealings with them by refusing to purchase their merchandise until that peace, safety, and good order which they have disturbed be perfectly restored. And that all tea now in this colony, or which shall be imported into it, shipped before the first day of September next, shall be deposited in some storehouse to be appointed by the respective committee of each country until a sufficient sum of money be raised by subscription to reimburse the owners the value, and then to be publicly burned and destroyed, if the same is not paid for and destroys the aforesaid, that it remain in the custody of the said committees at the risk of the owners, until the Act of Parliament imposing a duty upon tea for raising a revenue in America be repealed, and immediately afterwards be delivered unto the several proprietors thereof, their agents or attorneys. Now it is interesting that even as they were talking about destroying the tea, they were interested in preserving the private property rights of the owners of the tea. They felt the British government was using this tea as means of attacking the colonies, imposing a tax on them, destroying their own enterprise. But they were ready to reimburse when it was over, they said, those who owned the tea. They made it clear we had a respect for private property. Then 12, resolve that nothing will so much contribute to defeat the pernicious designs of the common enemies of Great Britain and her colonies as a firm union of the latter, who ought to regard every act of violence or oppression inflicted upon any one of them as aimed at all, and to effect this desirable purpose that a Congress should be appointed to consist of deputies from all the colonies, to concert a general and uniform plan for the defense and preservation of our common rights, and continuing the connection and dependence of the same colonies upon Great Britain under a just, lenient, permanent, and constitutional form of government. Now, here was a call for a United States of America in 1774 in the Fairfax County Resolve, saying, whether we have to fight and become independent, or whether it is merely to defend ourselves and force the British Crown to recognize our rights so we can be free men, we need a United States. We need to come together because we have the same common cause, the same problem. So, they said, we want to preserve our constitutional rights, and our purpose in forming a United States will be to further our constitutional freedom, whether or not we stay within the British Empire. Then 13, resolve that our most sincere and cordial thanks be given to the patrons and friends of liberty in Great Britain for their spirited and patriotic conduct in support of our constitutional rights and privileges, and their generous efforts to prevent oppressive distress and calamity in America. Does anyone know what great member of Parliament was at this time giving some tremendous speeches in favor of America? They had him in mind when the Fairfax men made this resolve. Edmund Burke, B-U-R-K-E. Edmund Burke, a very, very great Englishman. And in his speech on American taxation, April 19, 1774, Burke said, nothing in the history of mankind is like their progress. That is the progress of the American colonies. Each colony had in effect sole disposal of her own internal government. And Burke went on to say that after the French and Indian War, Britain had changed its attitude towards the colonies. Then a scheme of government, new and many things, seemed to have been adopted. And so Burke urged to revert to your old principles, seek peace, and ensue it. Leave America, if she has taxable matters in her, to tax herself. And so there were many friends of the Americans in Parliament, but the government was controlled by the king and his ministers. And 14, resolved that every little jarring interest and dispute which has ever happened between these colonies should be buried in eternal oblivion, and all manner of luxury and extravagance ought immediately to be laid aside, as totally inconsistent with the threatening and gloomy prospect before us. That it is the indispensable duty of all the gentlemen and men of fortune to set examples of temperance, fortitude, frugality, and industry, and give every encouragement in their power, particularly by subscriptions and premiums, to the improvement of arts and manufactures in America. That great care and attention should be had to the cultivation of flax, cotton, and other materials for manufactures, and we recommend it to such of the inhabitants as have large stocks of sheep, to sell to their neighbors at a moderate price as the most certain means of speedily increasing our breed of sheep and quantity of wool. Now, this is a very, very interesting one. Remember, we said mercantilism was the policy. So that if you wanted to buy clothing, you had to buy it from England. The idea that the colonists made their own clothing is nonsense. They bought it from England. They sent the cotton and the wool to England. It was made into cloth, made into dresses and suits, and then brought back here and sold. Well, now, suddenly, with a war facing them, it meant they were going to have no source of clothing. As a matter of fact, during the war, some of the slaves, during the hot weather, went virtually naked. There weren't enough clothes to hand down to them anymore because everybody was having to wear their clothes. So, the Fairfax resolve said, we must therefore work to develop our own arts and industries, our own arts and crafts. And they did. There are some very remarkable stories about one young man in New England who had to go to war. He was volunteering as a soldier, provided your own uniform, and his family went to work. They sheared some of the sheep. They turned it into thread. They wove it. They made it into a garment, sewed it in about 48 hours. All the women both working around the clock. Now, this was new work to them. They were not used to doing this. They had been buying all their clothes. So consider what it would be if suddenly the only way you could have clothing would be to go out, if you had a farm, and shear the sheep and do everything from there on to provide your own clothing. But they were up against it. It was either that or have nothing. And they did. So this is one of the very remarkable stories of the War of Independence. The extent to which the women folk went to work and they developed these things that they had no knowledge of. The spinning wheel came back into fashion suddenly. They had to have something like that. Then the 15th resolve. Resolve that until American grievances be redressed by restoration of our just rights and privileges, no goods or merchandise whatsoever ought to be imported into this colony, which shall be shipped from Great Britain or Ireland after the first day of September next, except linens not exceeding 15 cents per yarn, coarse woolen cloth not exceeding 2 shillings sterling per yard, nails, wire and wire cars, needles and pins, paper, saltpeter, and medicines, which may be imported until the first day of September, 1776. And if any goods or merchandise other than those hereby accepted should be shipped from Great Britain after the time aforesaid to this colony, that the same immediately upon their arrival should either be sent back again by the owners, their agents or attorneys, or stored and deposited in some warehouse, to be appointed by the committee for each respective county, and there kept, at the risk and charge of the owners, to be delivered to them when a free importation of goods hither shall again take place, and that the merchants and vendors of goods and merchandise within these colonies ought not to take advantage of our present distress, but continue to sell the goods and merchandise which they now have, or which may be shipped to them before the first day of September next, at the same rate and prices they have been accustomed to do within 1 year last past. And if any person shall sell such goods on any other terms than above expressed, that no inhabitant of this colony should at any time forever thereafter deal with him, his agent, factor, or storekeepers for any commodity whatsoever. Now this is common sense thinking. These were practical men. They knew how dependent they were on the colony. So they said, we have set a cut-off date. Up to that date we will buy these English goods. But after that date, we will not. So if there's something like needles or cloth that you need, get out. After that, we're going to be dependent on our own resources, until such time as the British Crown changes its policy. Now, they were afraid that Britain would not. They were quite aware of how hostile the British were to any American independence. An English scholar of the last century has said, and I quote, the way in which English statesmen looked upon our colony in the last century was that they owed everything to England, and that therefore it was only fair that they should be exploited in the interest of the mother country. Total exploitation. And the men of Fairfax do it. So they said, well, we don't expect a change to come about. These men are not likely to change unless they're back into the law. We had better be prepared for a long, long period of trouble, probably war, maybe independence, maybe a turning and a change in Britain. But, in any case, let us be practical and let us prepare. The English felt the colonies had no right to any economic freedom and independence. And because the American colonies were gaining increasing economic independence, they felt it was necessary to destroy their political independence, or else the colonies would become more and more free of Britain. And the result surprised them, because they did not expect the colonies to succeed. One scholar in Canada has said about the conclusion of the war, and I quote, what was Britain's surprise after the American Revolution? To find that the independent and prosperous United States was a far better customer than the closely regulated 13 colonies had ever been. In other words, as a free people, they were better customers than they had been as a subject people. Then the 16th resolve. Resolve that it is the opinion of this meeting that the merchants and vendors of goods and merchandise within this colony should take an oath not to sell or dispose of any goods or merchandise whatsoever which may be shipped from Great Britain after the first day of September next is aforesaid, except the articles before accepted. And they will, upon receipt of such prohibited goods, either send the same back again by the first opportunity, or deliver them to the committees in the respective counties to be deposited in some warehouse at the risk and charge of the owners, until they, their agents or factors, be permitted to take them away by the said committees. The names of those who refuse to take such oaths be advertised by the respective committees in the counties wherein they reside, and to the end that the inhabitants of this colony may know what merchants and vendors of goods and merchandise have taken such oaths, that the respective committees should grant a certificate thereof to every person who shall take the same. Now, this was just plain hard common sense. They said, if any businessman won't play the game with us, then we're going to advertise that fact. After all, Britain is taking economic reprisals against us. This is warfare. So any businessman who will work with Britain, we're going to advertise who they are. Because if they're out to destroy us, we're going to be out to destroy them. Now that's good, hard sense. In a time of war, you don't help the enemy. The 17th, resolve. Resolve that it is the opinion of this meeting that during our present difficulties and distress, no slave ought to be imported into any of the British colonies on this continent. And we take this opportunity of declaring our most earnest wishes to see an entire stop forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. Now again, this is something you're never told. Here in Virginia, before the war begins, coming out strongly against slavery. There was strong anti-slavery sentiment in the South. Now, South Carolina was the violently pro-slavery state. But at one time, abolishing slavery. Again, this is not something you hear about. The only reason it was not abolished was they didn't know what to do with them after they abolished them. And this was a problem to the Southerners. And again, they would say to the abolitionists, now look, if you have an answer for what to do with them, you tell us. And of course, there was no answer to that anyone had to offer. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, described the situation in Georgia at the outbreak of the Civil War as anti-slavery. And he said 8/10 would have abolished slavery if they could have seen what better they could do with the colored people than they were doing. Now remember, in the South, only 1 out of 17 men had slaves. 1 out of 17. Now, do you think those 16 men were likely to be pro-slavery? Those 16 white men who didn't have slaves? They were naturally anti-slave. The 18th resolve that no kind of lumber should be exported from this colony to the West Indies until America be restored to her constitutional rights and liberties, if the other colonies will accede to a like resolution, and that it be recommended to the General Congress to appoint as early a day as possible for such stopping of export. The West Indies were very important to both France and Great Britain, and they knew that if they exported to the West Indies, Great Britain would, of course, be able to get the lumber. And they wanted to keep the lumber from getting to Britain. The lumber was very important for the British economy. The British ships were being built, and the masts were extremely important for ships, depended upon American timber. Then the 18th resolve that it is the opinion of this meeting, if American grievances be not redressed before the first day of November, 1775, that all exports of produce from the several colonies to Great Britain should cease, and to carry the said resolution more effectively into execution, that we will not plant or cultivate any tobacco after the crop now growing, providing the same measure shall be adopted by the other colonies on this continent, as well as those who have heretofore made tobacco as those who have not. And it is our opinion also that non-exportation, if the Congress of Deputies from the several colonies shall adopt the measure of non-exportation to Great Britain, as the people will be verified disabled from paying their debts, that no judgment should be rendered by the courts in the said colonies for any debt after information of the said measures being determined upon. In other words, we will no longer produce crops that are to be England. And therefore, this will cause great economic dislocation. So, there will be a debt moratorium if all the colonies will agree to this. During the war, the Continental Congress did call for boycotts. And to a large extent, for a time, there were no payments of debt. Now, this was a help to irresponsible people in that they did not have to pay debt during the war years, and many of the irresponsible people became pro-American instead of pro-loyalist as a result. But all the same, it was necessary. The economy of the countries was very severely dislocated, of the various colonies. And the court more or less ceased to function, so that you had a very serious cessation of local government during the war years. They were the battleground, each of the colonies, and as a result, there was very little in the way of effective government. We fail to realize how, when a country becomes a battleground, normal life ceases. A few years ago, I met a young woman, well, not too young, but she was a war bride from the Netherlands. She had married an American serviceman. And she had been a schoolgirl when the war broke out, approximately a junior high age. That was 39. The war was over in 46, 45 and 6, depending on the area. Good many years. It meant that during her junior and senior high school years and part of her college years, she had no schools. There were no schools operating. It was occupied territory. It was a battleground, in part, and occupied territory. And so, the interesting thing was, I knew more about Dutch history than she did. She knew very little about her history. Consider what would happen if, for 4 years, or 6 years, or 7 years, Virginia had no schools open, the extent to which everyone would be ignorant, say, of American history and Virginia history. War creates a severe dislocation. And that's why wars are so very dangerous. When war is over, conditions are very, very different than they were before. Now, this is a fact that politicians in recent years have realized. And therefore, they have become very emphatically pro-war in that respect. They realize that a war is a means of conducting a revolution. In effect, the United States had a revolution in 1917 and 18. A tremendous centralization of government. So that after the First World War, this country was not the same as it was before. The Second World War was the same thing. The powers of the government were tremendously increased. The Korean War and the Vietnam War again did the same thing. You see, modern warfare especially, since it requires far more in the way of expenditures and controls of the people, is a form of revolution. It is exceedingly dangerous for a modern country to go into a war. It means a loss of liberties to the people in most cases. The 20th resolve and the 21st, read them both together. 20th resolve, that it is the opinion of this meeting that a solemn covenant and association should be entered into by the inhabitants of all the colonies upon oath. They will not, after the time which shall be respectfully agreed upon at the General Congress, export any manner of lumber to the West Indies, nor any of their produce to Great Britain, or sell or dispose of the same to any person who shall not have entered into the same covenant and association. And also that they will not import or receive any goods or merchandise which shall be shipped from Great Britain after the first day of September next, other than the before enumerated articles, nor buy or purchase any goods except as before accepted of any person whatsoever who shall not have taken the oath therein before recommended to be taken by the merchants and vendors of goods, nor buy or purchase any slaves hereafter imported in any part of this continent, until free exportation and importation be again resolved on by a majority of the representatives and or deputies of the colonies, and of the respective committees of the counties in each colony, so soon as the covenant and association becomes general, published by advertisements in their several counties a list of the names of those, if any such there be, who will not speak thereto, that such traitors to their country may be publicly known and detested. 21. Resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that this and the other associating colonies should break off all trade intercourse and dealings with that colony, province, or town which shall decline or refuse to agree to the plan which shall be adopted by this General Congress. Well, at this point, the colonies did not go along with the Fairfax result. During the war, they traded very actively with the enemy. They figured, here's a good chance to make money. After all, the British troops are a long ways from home, and it's cheaper for them to buy their supplies from us than to buy them in Britain and ship them here. Now, this was, of course, extremely selfish on their part, but it still had an important effect. You see, what the men of Fairfax in these resolves do not realize is this, that yes, trading with the enemy in a sense would be neglecting the American interest, but trading with the enemy is always a profitable thing. And a great deal of the wealth of Britain flowed to America as a result. And the British banks were very much in danger of collapsing time and again. Because since the generals here found we can buy the goods a little more cheaply here, we'll buy them here. So they had to send to England by ship for money, which meant gold. And America was literally awash with gold during the war. Now, the Continental Congress didn't get it because it didn't have a power of taxing. But the people of the colonies really got rich. So, after the war, when the country was free, it began as a rich people, which is more important than having a rich government. Our government today is very rich because it's taking it out of our pockets in the form of exorbitant taxes. So, trading with the enemy was an important thing for getting the new country started. If there had not been this trade with the enemy, after the war, the United States would have been decapitalized. Now, you cannot begin any kind of industry, any kind of work, if you are decapitalized. Remember, last night when we were dealing with mercantilism, and I mentioned the roads of the frontier, I said that for anyone to move west in those days meant 2 years' capital. 2 years' capital. Consider what it meant for immigrants to come to this country. Moved westward instead of staying, say, in New York or Boston. It meant that they had to come with capital. How did they get that capital? Well, very often they left the old country for religious reasons or political reasons because of the tyranny there, or to escape the draft, because many people who came to this country, say from Germany, came here because they resented the draft and the tyranny of the draft, a very brutal draft of the German states. And so they would pick up everything, sell everything, and come here. Now, very often, the white salary was the money with which they would move westward and buy land and live for a couple of years until they could travel. It takes capital to start any kind of enterprise. If you decapitalize a country, you destroy its potential. It isn't enough, say, to turn loose some people on America, a very marvelous continent or in a beautiful country, and say, okay, go to work now, let's make something out of this. Two things are required to develop any area: work and capital. Work and capital. Yes. Well, some did. Some did. But when they came over full, they worked here for somebody else until they accumulated the capital and then moved westward, you see. Now, in many cases, the early Puritans and the Pilgrims were well-to-do people by and large. They were middle-class people. But one of the problems in South America is, of course, there's a very rich continent down there. Consider Brazil. Brazil has the potential to be one of the richest countries in the world. But there is the unwillingness to work and the lack of capitalization, because what money they have, they spend on pleasure. And the result is that the areas of Brazil that are really booming are the Protestant areas, because there is the Puritan sense of thrift there. Another tremendously wealthy country, which could be today the greatest country in the world, is the Soviet Union. But there's no way of capitalization. And also there's no real work. But even if they worked hard there, without capitalization they can do nothing. And so they get nowhere. We have an account from one of the early French travelers who came here, how the Americans who went westward went with all kinds of capital. First of all, their capital would be tools. You'd carry with you as you traveled, say, in the early days to Kentucky, axes, saws, hammers, nails, every kind of tool imaginable. Now, that's one form of capital. And then you'd take money so that you could live until you cleared a parcel of land and planted it and developed it. So, true, some who came over were very poor. But they went to work in Baltimore or New York or Boston or wherever they landed and earned money and then moved out to the land. Capitalist and work. Those are the two things necessary. The romantic idea is that people went out with nothing but their hands and that they accomplished something. It is a romantic idea. It has no relationship to reality. It's a good thing that at this point the Fairfax resolves were not. Yes. And the people did trade with the enemy and accumulated capital. This is why the young country took off so well. They had so many foreign coins here. They were trading with the French, with the Spanish, with the English, that when the Constitution says that Congress shall have a right to coin money and to establish weights and measures and the values thereof, what it means was that up until the Civil War, at least, a lot of the money that was floating around in this country was foreign money. If sometimes you can see some of the advertisements of the 1820s, 30s, 40s, you'll be surprised. You'll see the prices listed as in shillings sometimes, or in Spanish dollars. Why? Because so much of that coinage was floating around. So you would give a price of something and 2 or 3 times the money because they were all good. And you would receive all of them. And you receive them in terms of weight and measure. So that, let us assume Dave here was a businessman in Fairfax County in 1830 or 40. He would have, if he didn't know it by heart, and he would very quickly, a list of the weights in gold grams and in silver grains of all the French, Spanish, and English coins. He would know this by heart. He might even know Dutch. After all, New York was a Dutch state. There would be a lot of Dutch coins floating around, and some of them might be down here too. So that immediately he would know the price of something in American dollars, in British sovereigns, in Spanish mil dollars, in French francs, and in Dutch guilders. This is a matter of course. And most people would know the same thing, and they'd use those coins interchangeably. Now, one of the things that was common in those days, too, was the right to mint your own money. You know that right was only eliminated by Congress about 100 years ago? But in California, there was a great deal of privately minted money. Now, if you minted a bad coin, it wouldn't move. They'd say, oh, well, John Doe over there is producing coins that are no good. Don't take his money. But if Moffett and Company, and that was one of the companies that was making gold coins, was making good coins, everybody would say, I want Moffat's coins. Now, in the early days of California, after the gold rush, there was practically no American minted money in California. They were way out there in the wilderness, the other end of the country. So what did they do? A great many individuals or companies started minting their own coins, gold coins. They're worth a lot of money today. And everybody prefers them. As a matter of fact, a little later, during and after the war, when there were Lincoln greenbacks, if you went to California as a stranger and you had a wad of Lincoln greenbacks and you went into a store and you bought something with a greenback, you'd buy it once. But they didn't want the paper money, they wanted the gold. Next time you came back and said, I'd like to have a sack of flour. Sorry, we're all out. Oh, what's that sack over there? A sack of them. Well, they're all spoken for. They didn't want your paper. They had to take it according to the government. The next time, they were all out of everything you wanted. So if you wanted to go back there and buy something, you'd better go out and work with some gold money, and then go back jingling the gold coin in your hand and say, I'm here to buy something. Well, we have just a few minutes, so let's go ahead with the last 3 of the resolve. The 22nd. Resolve that should the town of Boston be forced to submit to these cruel and oppressive measures of government, that we shall not hold the same to be binding upon us, but will notwithstanding religiously maintain and inviolably adhere to such measures as shall be concerted by the General Congress for the preservation of our lives, liberties, and fortune. In other words, if they conquer Boston by invasion, the men of Fairfax said that their resistance would continued. And then they declared, in conclusion, the last two. 23. Resolved that it be recommended to the deputies of the General Conference to draw up and transmit an humble and dutiful petition and remonstrance to His Majesty, asserting with decent firmness our just and constitutional rights and privileges, lamenting the fatal necessity of being compelled to enter into measures disgusting to His Majesty and its Parliament, or injurious to our fellow subjects in Great Britain, declaring in the strongest terms our duty and affection to His Majesty's person, family, and government, and our desire to continue our dependence upon Great Britain, and most humbly conjuring and beseeching His Majesty not to reduce His faithful subjects of America to a state of desperation, and to reflect that from our sovereign there can be but one appeal. And it is the opinion of this meeting that after such petition and remonstrance shall have been presented to His Majesty, the same shall be printed in the public papers in all the principal towns of Great Britain. 24. Resolved that George Washington and Charles Broadwater, lately elected our representatives to serve in the General Assembly, be appointed to attend the convention at Williamsburg on the first day of August next, and present these resolves as the sense of the people of this county upon the measures proper to be taken in the present alarming and dangerous situation of America. Now, this document is important to understanding the War of Independence. The Fairfax resolves make it clear that the American colonies were never under England or under English rule. They simply had a common monarch in King George III. They went to war at the attempt of the English Parliament to strip them of their independence. And they declared emphatically that this colony and dominion of Virginia can never be considered as conquered territory. And if it was that the present inhabitants are the descendants not of the conquered, but of the conquered. A very important document. We've given some time to it to consider it in detail. As I said, we will consider this and the Declaration of Independence in some detail. And that it is important in order to understand the constitutional grounds of the war. Are there any questions? We have about a minute and a half. Yes. Yes. Well, trade with the Soviet Union would be good if it were honest trade. For gold. But today, our trade, we have no trade with the Soviet Union. What we have are subsidies to the Soviet Union at the expense of the American taxpayer. Just gold trade. Yeah. Well, the answer to that is that if you get into technology and arms, for the most part, they already have everything we have. They get it for nothing. They steal it. We might as well get some money for it. A very important book, National Suicide, by Anthony Sutton, goes into the fact that they have already our technology. Virtually all Soviet technology, at least 90% and perhaps close to 100, has been gained from foreign countries, predominantly the United States. Why not get some money for it? Gold. It's a much more honest basis. In other words, economics should not be governed by politics. That's what leads to socialism.
This has been a Chalcedon Foundation production, produced by Grace Community School and Nicene Covenant Church. If you enjoyed this lecture, be sure to visit chalcedon.edu for more lectures and series by R.J. Rushdoony and the Chalcedon Foundation.